When you feel mentally fatigued, drained, irritable, impatient, don't reach for the device. That's your brain signaling to you that it needs some kind of break, and that we recommend that that break be something out in nature. It can be short. It could be 10 minutes or 15 minutes. We think anything will help. You could even just listen to some nature sounds or look at some nature pictures, but I highly recommend that you try going out.
This is Wild by Nature, stories of human connection to the wild. This is a podcast exploring how nature, ancient wisdom, and lived experience guide us back to purpose, balance, and belonging. I'm your host, Vian Sharif, and if you've ever felt the pull to slow down, reconnect, and listen more closely to the world around you, you're in the right place. Hello, and welcome to Wild by Nature. Have you ever had a moment when you felt mentally drained, disconnected, like you just can't focus the way you used to? We think we need more discipline or a new productivity app, but what if the problem isn't you? What if it's the environment you're in? Today, we're exploring a powerful idea that nature isn't just something we visit, it's something our brains actually depend on. And joining me is someone who has spent his career proving exactly that. Marc G. Berman is a leading environmental neuroscientist, chair of the psychology department at the University of Chicago, and author of Nature and the Mind. His research has helped define an entirely new field, one that shows how nature shapes our attention, our mental health, and even how we connect with each other. Welcome, Professor Berman.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Professor Berman, you've spent years studying the connection between nature and the brain. And when was the moment for you that happened that highlighted that this isn't just a theory, it's something very real and something that we can start to unpack in real data scientific terms?
When I was a graduate student, I took a course with Professor Steve Kaplan, and he was a pioneer in the field of environmental psychology. And in his course, he introduced me to this theory called attention restoration theory, that humans might be able to restore their attention, improve their productivity, improve their concentration, not just with pharmacological interventions or some kind of cognitive training, but the actual physical environment that's around us could impact our ability to restore our attention. And I just thought it was such a fascinating idea, something that I had not heard too many people talk about. People were not really focused in psychology and neuroscience about the physical environment. People were so focused on the individual and individual characteristics, but not about how the person kind of interacts with the environment and how that can affect people's attention. A lot of people think that this ability to direct attention, our working memory capacity, is sort of a fixed trait. You're just born with a certain amount and that's it. And here we were showing that after a brief 50-minute walk in nature, you can improve in this test by about 20%. So I think that made me and a lot of other people, believers that this could have a really, really powerful impact on human psychology.
It's so powerful to hear that because it suggests that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Why does this matter so much now? What's happening to us in modern life?
There's a lot of distraction and a lot of things that are vying for our attention and depleting our attention. So I think when a lot of people hear the word attention, they may not take it too seriously, that, they might think about children having trouble paying attention in school or, maybe having difficulty being productive at work. But we think attention and in particularly our ability to direct attention, to control what we're paying attention to, is a really, really fundamental and critical human resource that underlies a lot of different things. So when you become mentally fatigued and you can't focus, you become more irritable. It's hard to achieve your goals. You become more impatient. You may become more aggressive. And so we think our ability to sort of direct and control our attention is a very, very precious psychological resource that's needed for lots of different things. And I think a lot of things in the modern world, our devices, social media, social network devices, streaming services, all of those things are vying for our attention. They're capturing our attention, and we think it's not just a neutral behavior, but it's a fatiguing behavior. It's depleting our attention even further, which then again makes it difficult to be our best selves. And the hard part is that a lot of those technologies, and I'm not anti-technology, but a lot of these technologies, they're they're designed to keep you kind of hooked. They're addictive. And most addictions are not good. They're not beneficial. So it, it's it's something that we're fighting against, but it feels restful. That's the thing that I think is really, really challenging about it. It's so easy. It seems like streaming something or scrolling through social media feels, kind of restful, but is actually further depleting. And when you ask people after they've been on these devices for a while, they do report being more fatigued. So what we're suggesting is that when you feel that mental fatigue, when it's really hard to concentrate, when you're getting a little bit irritable, do not reach for your device. That's when we think it's a really good time to try to get some kind of interaction with nature.
You've talked about this in your book for sure. This idea that, or this understanding that screen based attention leads to this continuous application of effort and focus. Whereas, in contrast, nature offers us something different. So, the lives we're living today with our devices and so on, that's not just about distraction. It's actually about something deeper, and that's depletion. What is it about nature that allows the brain either to recover or have a different experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe I'll talk about it at a few different levels. So the first, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what attention restoration theory is, and that was the theory that Steve Kaplan and his wife Rachel Kaplan uh, sort of codified. And the key element of attention restoration theory is that humans sort of have two kinds of attention. So one kind of attention is the one that I've been talking about called directed attention, where you as an individual person decide what you're going to pay attention to. And it's thought that that kind of attention is fatigable or depletable. You can only sort of control your attention for so long before you become mentally fatigued, and then it's just very hard to focus. And we've all had that sensation at the end of a long workday where you might be staring at your computer screen and you're just kind of mind wandering. It's very hard to focus. And that's what we would call sort of a directed attention fatigue state. That's different from involuntary attention, which is the kind of attention that's automatically activated by interesting stimulation in the environment. So bright lights, loud noises, those kinds of stimuli automatically capture our attention, and we don't have any control over it. And it's thought that that kind of attention is less susceptible to fatigue or depletion. So you don't often hear people say, "Oh, I can't look at that beautiful waterfall anymore. It's just too interesting. I have to look away." "Oh, I can't watch this really interesting movie anymore. It's just so interesting. It's tiring me out. I have to shut it off." So the idea behind attention restoration theory is that if you can find environments that don't place a lot of demands on directed attention, while simultaneously having interesting stimulation to activate this involuntary attention, you might be able to restore or replenish this precious directed attention resource. And we think natural environments are one sort of environment that can do that. There's also one other point that I think is important to make, which was that we think the kind of stimulation that captures our involuntary attention, we say should be softly fascinating and not harshly fascinating. So what do I mean by that? When I look at that beautiful waterfall, it captures my attention, but it doesn't capture my attention in an all-consuming way. I can still mind wander and think about other things when I'm looking at that beautiful waterfall. When I'm in Times Square in New York, wow, it's also really interesting. Lots of stimulation to capture my involuntary attention, but it sort of does so in a very harsh and all consuming way. It's very difficult to kind of mind wander or think about other things when you're in Times Square. So we also think it's important that the kind of stimulation to capture involuntary attention should be softly fascinating, things that are interesting, but not sort of all consuming.
So it's almost as if our brains understand that they need to reset and they know how to, but only in the right kinds of environment. Um, and in terms of the actual reset that's happening there from a focus perspective, how powerful is that? And what kind of changes are we really talking about?
I mean, it's a really important question. That the walking study that we did, produced a 20% improvement in this ability to direct attention. That's a big effect. It's interesting to try to think about, okay, how can we translate that into, GDP or
Yeah.
mental health or some other kind of metric like that, we're working on that. So I can say, for example, other researchers have found that when there's more green space around schools or children's homes, children perform better in school. Their grades are better. There's less behavioral issues. We find that interactions with nature can be really, really beneficial for people who've been diagnosed with clinical depression, and they have very challenging, memory and attention problems. And we find these very, very strong effects for people suffering from clinical depression. Other research are finding that children with ADHD, brief interactions with nature for them can have effects that are similar to a dose of Ritalin. So I think there's a lot.
That's interesting,
Yeah,
really. My
yeah.
goodness.
So again, you can't make a strong. We can't say we can eliminate Ritalin. They have to do more clinical trials, but it's very suggestive, at least even as a supplement for pharmacological interventions. Interactions with nature could be, very helpful, salubrious for people, suffering from ADHD. So I think there's a lot of evidence now that's being produced in environmental neuroscience that these are fairly dramatic improvements. And I would also say that a lot of the research is just doing the most conservative tests. And what do I mean by that? We tested people who took a 50-minute walk in nature. That's a brief walk in nature one time. And, we did that because that's logistically feasible. Imagine a scenario where we had people interact with nature multiple times for multiple months, and maybe the nature wasn't just their local park, but it was a more grand national park. I would venture a guess that those effects are going to be much stronger. So I I think I think again, we're sort of just scratching the surface in terms of really quantifying these benefits. And my hunch is that they are going to be quite profound. And the other thing that's interesting too about this work is that there's really no side effects. I mean, very few people go for a walk in nature and regret it and say, "Oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that." And
Yeah.
there's actually other work that shows people actually undervalue how good the walk in nature will be. So this is work that was done by John Zelensky and Elizabeth Nisbet, where they asked people before going on a walk in nature, how much do you think you're going to enjoy this walk in nature? And then they asked another set of participants after they walked in nature, how much would you enjoy this walk in nature? And it turns out the people that rated how much they would enjoy it beforehand really underestimated how much they would actually enjoy it. So, um, and I think that's something that's also kind of in our collective psychology is that we look at nature as being nice and an amenity, but just an amenity. If we have the resources, if we have enough money, then we can bring more nature in. And I think the collective research in this topic is suggesting that it's not an amenity; it's actually a necessity.
I mean, it's extraordinary to understand some of these findings that you've surfaced and how accessible these benefits are. And also, I think some of your research shows that people don't even need to like nature. It's like vegetables; they're just good for you. It's just good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the more counterintuitive findings that we had. So many people joke with me, of course, nature is good, Mark. We've known that for millennia. Um, but what was interesting is that a lot of people think that the reason why nature has these psychological benefits is because a lot of nature is a preferred environment, that it just puts people in a better mood. And that's why we're seeing these improvements in directed attention. But we actually found that that the liking is not necessarily a critical element. So um, at a correlational level, we also recorded people's mood change when they went for the walk in nature versus the walk in the urban environment. And it was the case that people did show larger mood improvements after the nature walk compared to the urban walk, but there wasn't really a strong relationship or correlation between improvements in mood and improvements in directed attention. So it wasn't the case that the people that improved their mood the most were the ones that improved their directed attention the most. But an even stronger demonstration of this was that we had participants walk at different times of the year. So some people walked in June when, it was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius, and participants really enjoyed the walk. They said, "I can't believe, Mark, you're paying me for going for a walk in nature." They showed these healthy mood effects, healthy directed attention benefits. But we also had people walk in January when it was about 25 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 10 Celsius. Participants did not enjoy the nature walk, but they still showed the same directed attention benefit as the people that walked in June. And so that's where we sort of got this saying that you don't need to enjoy or like the nature walk to get these cognitive benefits. It's not like a hedonic pleasure
Yeah.
response necessarily. It's something deeper going on.
It's biology or chemistry somehow. Um, what are you seeing when it comes to mental health and your research? Um, States like anxiety, depression, even grief. How has that improved, or how does that interface with this nature research, this environmental psychology?
Yeah, well, it's very related. And I think it's also related to, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, where he's been positing that one of the reasons why there's been large increases in anxiety is because of technology and social media and things like that, and children just spending so much time on the screen where they may be getting depleted. They're doing a lot of social comparison, which is bad for mental health, and that's producing a lot of anxiety. And you know, the solution there would be to try to limit that. And I think what I and others are suggesting is, not just limiting um, some of this technology use, but substituting it for these natural environment interactions. And I've talked about how interacting with nature can be really beneficial for people suffering from clinical depression. Interacting with nature can be really beneficial for people with ADHD. Um, Interacting with nature has been found to be really beneficial for women who are recovering from breast cancer and receiving breast cancer treatments and are under very high stress and, having like chemo brain fog. Interacting with nature can be really, really beneficial for them. There's some suggestion that interacting with nature is related to reduced aggression and reduced crime. Um, Interacting with nature is related to increased cooperation. Interacting with nature has been related to having more reflective thoughts and thinking less about ourselves and more about others. So, why is this all happening? I think a lot of it has to do with directed attention, but some of it might have to do with other things too. And we haven't even touched on, physical health benefits of interacting with nature, where people are finding, for example, that, in a hospital, if you have a view of nature out your window compared to a view of like a brick wall, patients recover faster from surgery just having the view of nature. And we find that having more nature in your neighborhood is related to, lower cardiovascular diseases. So there's a myriad of benefits to nature. There may be different reasons why nature is having these benefits. But it's it's multifaceted. It seems like there's just many, many different kinds of benefits to having nature. It could be mental health benefits, it could be physical health benefits, but also kind of social health benefits.
On that last point, Professor Berman, your research, as you say, touches on how we relate to other people. Um, Tell us a bit more about what happens to us socially as a result of time we might spend in nature or we're all spending in nature and so on. What's the relationship to relationship, let's say?
Part of our thinking is that it takes attention to have good relationships, to have good positive relationships requires attention. It requires being responsive to somebody. It requires having self-control. And when we don't have that, when our directed attention is depleted, it's much easier to be irritable, to say something that maybe you wish you hadn't said. It's difficult to control impulses. So we think, you know, having strong, positive social relationships does require attention. And if nature can improve our attention, then that should improve social relationships. Experimentally, when we test this, we've done studies, for example, where we take people and have them walk in natural kind of arboretums or indoor conservatories versus having them walk in sort of indoor shopping malls that are both, very nice places to be in. And we give participants data enabled cell phones from our laboratory where we ping them and ask them, what are you thinking about while they're in these different environments? And when people were in the nature conservatory, people were more likely to think about other people in nature compared to the shopping mall. They were more likely to think about the environment. They were more likely to think about the past, and they were more likely to have sort of more positive thoughts. Whereas in the shopping mall, people felt like their thoughts were more impulsive. They were thinking more about themselves. They were thinking less about the environment. So something about being in nature sort of made people less sort of egocentric and more sort of outward thinking. And what's interesting about that is that in both environments, there are about the same number of people around, but it was only in nature that people um, sort of became less egocentric. And there have been other people that suggest that it's possible that when you're in sort of a beautiful nature setting, it can induce feelings of awe and that you are sort of part of something larger, and that might be one of the reasons why people start thinking less about themselves and maybe more about the environment and others.
Just on that topic, Professor Berman, one of my oldest friends, she's an associate professor now in Kent doing research on theology and sociology.
Mhm.
And one of the last pieces of research she did was around religion and spirituality in children growing up in our age today. And one of the findings was that nature has replaced our traditional role for religion in
Mhm.
bringing us awe back into our lives. So it might
Mhm.
be, it's sort of an interesting counter, oh, not counterpoint, an interesting additional thread or facet to this discussion.
Absolutely, and we actually have some work that's very related to that. So we collaborated with a private foundation in the United States that had built hundreds of parks in the Northeast. And it was interesting that this foundation called the TKF Foundation, now it's called Nature Sacred, they would have these characteristic wooden benches in their parks. And there was a journal or diary that was underneath the bench that people could write in. So this foundation actually transcribed all of these diary entries. So there were thousands of these diary entries when people are sitting in parks. And then we also had pictures of the parks, like what was contained in the parks. And one of my former students, Kate Schertz, what we did is we took all that text that people had written about And using some text analysis programs, we could quantify what people were writing about in these parks. So we had these topics of what people were writing about. One topic had to do with kind of nature and being in nature. Another topic had to do with sort of like spirituality and somebody's life journey. And it turned out then we had another set of participants rate the images for how natural they thought the park was. And so our first sanity check was when people rated the parks as being more natural, did people write more about this nature topic? And it turned out, yes, that was true. If the park was more natural, maybe had more trees, more biodiversity, some water, people that were sitting in the park were more likely to write about something related to nature. But what we found that was more interesting was that we could also quantify from these pictures how many curved edges were in the park, like how much curvature was there, leaves, going in kind of different directions, trees kind of going in different directions. And it turned out if the park had more curved edges, people were more likely to write thoughts about spirituality and their life journey, which we thought was pretty fascinating. But that was very correlational. So we don't know if it's really true that the curved edges were causing these thoughts. So then we ran an experiment where we exposed people to nature urban images that had more curved edges versus less curved edges. And it turns out that in that experiment, if the image you were looking at had more curved edges, it caused people to think more about spirituality and their life journey. And it gets even a bit more wild than that. We also wanted to see, could these curved edges produce this effect even if you don't know what you're looking at? So you can imagine like a Jackson Pollock painting that has many curved edges and mimics a lot of the patterns of nature, but you don't see trees or mountains or anything in those paintings. So we took our images and we basically scrambled them. So it preserved all the curved edges, but you didn't really know what you were looking at. And it turns out even looking at those images that have these curved edges, but in the absence of semantics, you don't really know what you're looking at. If the image has more curved edges, people were also more likely to think thoughts related to spirituality in their life journey. So this is interesting that, even architecturally, you might be able to manufacture an environment where it might mimic patterns of nature, and that might be able to cause people to have different kinds of thoughts.
Fascinating. And it makes me think then of the application of your work. So there must be myriad facets to your work and your research. If you had to describe to our listeners the most fascinating application of this that you're working on today, what would that be if you can?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different avenues. I mean, we do think that this work has applications to all built spaces. That any built space, um, you might be able to take advantage of these properties. So, and there is this field called biophilic design where people are trying to mimic patterns of nature in the built environment. And I think that's really important because actually for a lot of us, we don't have easy access to real nature. But you could imagine that um, if our interior spaces, outdoor building facades, if they mimic the patterns of nature, maybe we could still get some of these benefits. And we have found that, looking at pictures of nature versus pictures of urban scenes, you can get some of these benefits, but they're not quite as strong as the real thing. So real nature is best, but if you can't get access to real nature, even simulations of nature, be it a window to nature or an LCD screen or video screen, looking at nature pictures, listening to nature sounds, having
Um,
plants indoors, even if they're fake plants, can also produce some of these benefits. In terms of application, we've been talking to some, architects and designers to think, what can we do to because we say like to naturize these spaces to make them um, more vibrant for people who are spending so much time in those spaces. There's also other things, we've been trying to talk to city planners about, trying to bring more real nature into urban environments, around schools. But the trick kind of goes back to something that you asked before about sort of quantifying these benefits and, making the case that this is worth investing in versus investing in something else. And I think that's where we need more work. We did that somewhat in our study where we were looking at green spaces in the city of Toronto and how that was related to reductions in cardiometabolic disorders like stroke, diabetes, and heart disease. There, we found, for example, that having 11 more trees of average size per city block reduced these cardiometabolic disorders by 1%. That sounds pretty modest, but to get that equivalent decrease monetarily, you'd have to give every household in that city block about $20,000 and have them all move to a neighborhood that was about $20,000 wealthier or make people about 1.5 years younger. So, you know, there we were, kind of really trying to quantify these benefits, but I think we're going to need more of that kind of quantification to really get a lot of policy impact. And it's becoming really, really important, especially with climate change, and that's having impacts on the environment. Um, so really trying to think, okay, yes, it might cost more to design in this way. It might cost more to bring this natural stimulation, these natural environments into our built environment, but maybe it's going to pay off because of all these other benefits to mental and physical health.
Which are it's so great that this work is starting to do that, to quantify it and start to compare it with the cost of taking a more traditional approach, let's say, or prescriptive approach. But then coming back to this idea of the prescription, Professor Berman, you talked about a nature prescription, a short dose, or maybe a long dose. What does a nature prescription look like?
Well, I think there again too, or there are different levels to it, and I think at the first sort of most basic level, it's you know ensuring that every week you're getting some amount of time in a natural environment, and again, it doesn't have to be a grand natural environment. It can be a small local park that's close to you. And I think it also means being very vigilant to your own attention, that when you feel mentally fatigued, drained, irritable, impatient, don't reach for the device. That's your brain signaling to you that it needs some kind of break and that we recommend that break be something out in nature. It's also important that when you take that break in nature, you allow that stimulation to capture your involuntary attention. So that means don't bring your phone, don't have your earbuds in, go by yourself. You want to just not have any distraction. You want all of the natural stimulation to be consumed, basically, by your involuntary attention. So that's sort of like the first kind of prescription. I think after that, it kind of gets into like, sort of how we design our days and how we design our kids' days. Y- you know, I speculate in the book that, it's possible that it might be better if you have an 8-hour school day to have 6 hours of instruction for children and 2 hours of nature break. Maybe that's better. Maybe kids would learn more than just 8 hours straight of instruction. I don't have evidence for it yet, but if kids are drained, cramming more instruction may not be beneficial. It might be better to have more nature breaks in the day where kids will get more out of every instruction, and they may be less behavioral issues as well. We also, as adults, need to think about how we design our days also, and can we design them in a way where we make taking a nature break easy? And I think that's challenging because, especially in the US, we're in a culture of just working every second and just trying to cram as much work in. And that actually might be somewhat counterproductive. It might be better to actually design in some nature breaks. And the economist Richard Thaler, who's one of my colleagues at U Chicago, says, if you want somebody to do something, you have to make it easy. And I think currently we're not really making it easy to interact with nature. So how can we think about doing that individually? And then how can we think about doing that as a society? And then I think the nature prescription kind of bubbles out from there a little bit more. What can we do in our communities to have more nature? Can we, unfortunately, and again, this is a little bit more true in the US than maybe some other countries, but we're very car dominant society. And a lot of times there are very lovely parks that are right next to high traffic car areas, and you're just not going to get that same benefit if the nature is being kind of like overwhelmed by these urban sounds. And again, I think urban environments are great. I think cities are great. We have other research showing that more populated cities are better for depression. More populated cities have lower depression rates. More populated cities have lower racial biases. But cities have noise and car traffic and things like that. And if you can't really let your involuntary attention just be captured by that natural stimulation because there's so much distraction from the urban environment, you're not going to really get the same benefit. So, you know, that's twofold. That's one, I'm advocating we need to get more natural spaces into our built environment, but we also need to protect them in some sense from that built environment so that you can really get the benefit from that nature.
If we were sharing some incredibly practical elements or tools or tips for listeners of how to design nature breaks into one's day, which I think many of us do experience days where we are completely led by our screen. We might have 12 or 10 Zoom calls where we are constantly engaging, and you do feel depleted at the end of the day. How could we shift to something different? The other thing I'm struck by when you speak about this, Professor, is it's a very conscious act to rip oneself away from the thing that is so easy to do. One can very, very easily, and it's so compelling just to dive back into the phone. I mean, it really is. It's glued to us. It's extraordinary, really. I sense it will take quite an extraordinary amount of discipline to go, I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to take 15 minutes. I'm going to step away and I'm going to leave my phone on the counter. What are your thoughts on how we can actually make this real? We can actually make it happen.
I think you're kind of hitting on it that it's try starting small, try starting with something as easy, maybe just 5 minutes. And then slowly, you might be able to build. But I think you do have to build it into your schedule. So when you're scheduling meetings and stuff like that, you might have to reserve time in the day to do this. And often people, tell me, "Oh, Mark, thanks a lot. I already know I have to exercise and I have to eat well and I have to sleep enough and I have to have good social interactions. Now you're adding a fifth thing that I need to have. I don't have time for it." And they're kind of telling that tongue in cheek, but yeah, it's unfortunately, yes, it it is another thing to add to the list. But I think if you can take away some of that screen time, I do believe that most of us, there is time that we can remove to do this, to make room for this. And again, it doesn't have to be long. It can be short. It could be 10 minutes or 15 minutes. We think anything will help. You could even just listen to some nature sounds or look at some nature pictures. But I highly recommend that you try going out, and maybe you do different activities on the weekend. That's the other thing too. So, but I would encourage people to start small and to not put a lot of pressure on yourself. If it's stressing you out about it, just try to make it easy and simple first before making dramatic changes.
And I think this is where your research is so profoundly important because um, if we don't chart these benefits and expose the benefits of this amenity that we have, this nature amenity, but actually if we're starting to understand that there are real tangible health benefits, there are benefits to us as individuals relating to our productivity, and this isn't just an amenity. This is actually something that
Yes.
promises and is proven to make life
Yeah.
better.
Yes.
This is that surely should become a priority in some
Yes.
way in our daily
Yes.
lives.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of had an ulterior motive a little bit in the book, which is that kind of trying to capitalize on all of our sort of egocentrism, like this is good for you, and that, protecting the environment, don't worry about the polar bears. This is about you. This is about you and your productivity and your mental health. And it seems like we need nature for human flourishing to be our best selves. And that it's not about protecting. Of course, I'm into protecting other species and things like that, but this is really about you, and that it's so critical to our success. And I think when people feel that, and there's research to show this, when you do interact with nature more and get these benefits, you do care about the natural environment more too, and you'll be more motivated to protect it. So I think that can kind of create this sort of positive cycle, but you have to try it. You have to do it. And what I'm saying is start small, and I think you'll be able to build and find ways in your days to kind of get more exposure.
So powerful, Professor Berman. Thank you. Where can people learn more about your work?
Well, they can learn more about it from my book, Nature and the Mind, which is, kind of available on Amazon and wherever you get books. They can also check out my lab's website, which is it's enl.uchicago.edu, or Environmental Neuroscience Lab at UChicago. Um, and then, yeah, I've done a number of different podcasts where I talk about this research, and that would be another way to kind of hear more.
Thank you so much for making this so accessible and so profoundly important to our daily lives and ourselves. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening to Wild by Nature. If today's conversation sparked reflection, grounded you, or reminded you of what matters, take a moment to stay connected. Follow Wild by Nature on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join me as we continue exploring what it means to live in relationship with the earth and with each other. We'll see you next time.